Well, hello all you wonderful people out there in YouTube land. Welcome to yet another 8 Days of Christmas video. Before you we have a Bachmann 284 Berkshire. Now this locomotive is painted unlettered. This is from Mr. Jim Moe's collection, and he bought this specifically to be painted and unlettered so that he could decal it later for Polar Express for use on the Texla Railroad during the open house. This is a current production model locomotive. It has DCC on board, as you can tell by the lettering on the box right here and right here. So let's get into this. To get into the box, you just open the flap on one end, remove the plastic cradle and sleeve from the box. Also inside the box you will find the propaganda packet, your user manual and warranty card and some basic legalese. So the next step in the unboxing, you slide the cradle of the locomotive out of the plastic sleeve. Unlock the end. There's two ways you can do it. You can either unlock it here or unlock it here. I'm just going to go ahead and unlock it here. I'm not sure if this is like detail parts that come packaged like this that you have to install as the modeler, or if that was stuff that was removed for operational reasons. Lift and remove. And we'll set that aside. So, since the locomotive is not yet put together with respect to the wiring harness between the locomotive and the tender, I'm going to just go ahead and do the close-up camera work on the locomotive and the tender separately. So, starting off with the front end of the engine, you have a buttload of separately applied hand railing and grab iron detail all throughout the front end of the engine and along the boiler. You have this freestanding separately applied piping detail here, some cast on piping detailing right here and right here. Actually no, these are separately applied. Wow, that's a nice touch. Separately applied detailing all along the top of the boiler back towards the cab. Separately applied whistle, marker lights, grab iron here, air compressors. All the valve gear is accurate from what I can tell, and some very nicely done chemically darkened metal drive rods. You have some excellent rivet detailing along the firebox and some cast on piping detail. And you got some freestanding piping detail here and along the underside of the cab, as well as some pump detailing here, and you have the metal drawbar that connects the tender and the locomotive. Alright, so looking at the front end of this thing, you have a headlight here and a signal light, a Mars light right here. I don't think that is prototypically accurate. I'm not 100%. I'm not a Pierre Marquette guy. So, I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm not I don't believe that's prototypically accurate. That's more like a SP or UP style headlight arrangement. You got a little better view of the marker lights here and here, classification lights rather. You do have a bell right here, separately attached and separately applied number boards. The bell is cast in place, it does not move. A nice separately applied handrail detail here, and the uncoupling lever right here. A Bachmann magnetic easy mate knuckle coupler, and a prototypically accurate pilot with footboards on the front of the engine. And I'm not sure how well you can see them, but there are polling pockets located here and here on the locomotive. And it's a very nice detailing with the steps from the pilot to the walkway along the side of the boiler. You have also very well done cast on hinge detailing for the smoke box cover, as well as rivet and clamp detailing here on the smoke box door. Looking at the fireman side of the locomotive, you can see we have a little bit more detail. Alright, you have an air tank here, the main reservoir here, the brake cylinder here. You have a little extra piping detail on the along the side of the firebox here. Same excellent rivet detailing, but just some more cast on piping detailing. Other than the brake cylinder and the extra air tank and the extra piping on the firebox, the engineer and fireman side of the locomotive are identical. Looking at the top side of the locomotive, you can see this hatch here has got some prototypically accurate cast on clamp detailing. You have these hatches, these sand hatches. They are cast on to the locomotive. You have the prototypically accurate arrangement for the whistle. And you have this non-sliding, this cast on roof hatch here on the top of the locomotive that's cast into the open position. So looking into the interior of the cab, you can see it's fairly Spartan. I was actually kind of expecting a little bit more detail on the interior of this cab, given the amount of first-rate detailing this engine has throughout the rest of it. But as you can see, you have a very Spartan cab. You have some cast-on piping detailing here. You have a cast-on, you've just got and a cast-on firebox door with firebox lever, and that's really it. There's nothing in the cab really. Now you do have ample space in the cab to mount engineer and fireman figures, but I mean, there it is. That's about the most plain locomotive cab I have seen on a steam locomotive that I've reviewed in about a year. So here's the tender for this Berkshire. You can see, once I throw some light on it, you have some really nice rivet detailing all throughout the body of the tender. And the trucks are very nicely done. The locomotive and the tender are both plastic construction body. You do have separately applied hand railings along the top here. No hand railings here. Very nicely done, separately applied stirrup steps or ladders here, as well as a poling pocket right here along the side of the tender. Looking at the underside of the tender, those detail parts, that brake rigging that I showed earlier when I was pulling the engine out of the cradle, yeah, you can tell they were removed for operational purposes so this thing could go around some tighter radius curves. With those in place, I'm assuming this thing would not operate on 18-inch radius curves, and the previous Tesla modular railroad had 18-inch radius curves throughout on the main line. So there's the answer. The tender features electrical pickup on 8 of the 6 wheels, or, excuse me, 8 of the 12 wheels. Eventually I'll figure out math. And you do have these holes here, which means the engine is prepped for a speaker if you were to upgrade this from a regular DCC decoder to a sound DCC decoder. On the rear of the tender, you'll find more hand railings separately applied, a separately applied ladder, an operating directional headlight. The engine does have directional headlights. The uncoupling lever, more poling pockets, no safety tread on the pilot, more very nicely done rivet detailing, and another Bachmann Easy Mate operating knuckle coupler. Along the top side of the tender, you see the cast on coal load. Again, a little shiny for my taste. That would need to be toned down if this was my locomotive. Since this is not my locomotive, I'm not going to touch that. But that would be very easily toned down with just some either cinder ballast or a shot of dull coat. Cast on water hatches on the top of the tender, and of course more rivet detailing, and you have a nice visual of the separately applied hand railings all the way around the top of the water tank. Here we are looking at the front of the tender. Obviously this is the end of the tender that mates up with the rear of the steam locomotive. You have very, very minimalistic detailing along the coal bunker, which is actually accurate. Trying to hand fire a locomotive of this size with the rate at which it consumes coal would be tantamount to torture. I don't believe that any one human being could keep up with that. If you tried on flat level ground running either light engine or with a very light train, it might be doable. You'd be very frickin' sore afterwards if you were able to move at all the next day or week. But these engines had a steam-powered stoker that automatically fed coal from the coal bunker into the firebox. You have these cast-on little doors here, these storage hatches here, which they would use for storing, whatever they needed to store on the locomotive. Firebox pokers, a scoop, to knock out clinkers out of the firebox, things of such of that nature. There is no movable plate that sits down between the tender the floor of the tender and the floor of the locomotive cab, as you see on a lot of other modern HO scale steam locomotives, which is kind of a disappointment, but you know, it is what it is. And you have the wiring harness here, and if you run this locomotive, these need to be plugged in for it to work correctly, and I'm going to show you where those go here in a second. The last item is this little pin down here, this little shiny metallic pin that slips into one of two holes on the drawbar to connect the engine to the locomotive. These wires, do not rely on these to hold the engine together. You'll end up messing up the harness. Always slip that pin into one of the two holes. If you want the cab and the tender closer together and you're running on broader curves, then use the hole that's closest to the locomotive cab. If you're running on, you know, tighter curvature, then you use the farthest of the two pins from the rear of the locomotive. Alright, so as you can see, you have two plugs on the underside of the locomotive. You got two plugs on the tender. You have a 2-pin plug and a 4-pin plug. Now, real talk, don't ask me what the hell they do. I don't know what the specific function of each specific plug is. All I know is if you want this thing to run, you got to plug them in. So try to do this. And this is where the difference of HO versus O scale comes into play. Make sure you seat these all the way where you hear a click. You don't really have to push down all that hard, and I'd recommend that you don't, because these are small, delicate plugs. They're not super fragile, but they are very easily damaged. And make sure that they're facing the right way in relation to the holes in the plugs and the pins in the receivers. Because if you damage them, it is a royal pain in the arse to repair and replace them. You pretty much just have to cut the entire wiring harness off at the printed circuit board in the cab, or excuse me, tender, and just resolder a whole new wiring harness with a plug already on it. And the final step in connecting the engine together, this metal drawbar here, slip it, slip the pin through one of the holes on the drawbar. Now, like I said, if you want to run this engine on broad curves, say 24 inches and 24-inch radius and larger, you can put the pin through the closer hole, and that's the spacing that it gives you, which in truth is still probably a little too far away from the engine in terms of prototypical like measurements, but it looks a little bit better than this farthest spacing right here. Now, since the Stars Hollow Railroad is, as you know, if you've been watching the channel for a while, you already know Stars Hollow Railroad is 18-inch radius mainline, 18-inch radius industry curves. So we're going to be running with the tender in the second hole on the drawbar, so that this thing will actually operate on the railroad. Obviously, this should go without saying, but I'm going to say it. Make sure you have all the wheels of the locomotive on the rail before you apply power to the track. This engine is equipped with a dual mode decoder. and it is a smooth running locomotive. When this thing arrived on the property on loan from Jim, I ran a 25 car train with this thing and it did not even stumble. Now with the DCC decoder, the starting voltage on DC is fairly high, but as you can tell, it starts and it stops just smooth as Persian silk, I'll tell you what. And you could see the headlight come on there when it backed up. So like I said, directional lighting on the engine, and let's take this ore train around the railroad. As you can see, this engine handles these 18-inch radius curves like a champ, and as I mentioned earlier, it can pull. So those of you who are like me operating in DC and with 18-inch radius curves, you ain't stuck out, you want to get one of these, gone on ahead. You can run it. Now obviously the real 284 Berkshires that the Pear Marquette and nickel plate had were used in high-speed freight service, and this model will go a lot faster than this, but the purpose of this running portion is just to demonstrate how well it handles these 18-inch radius curves, not necessarily the speed capabilities of the engine. And as you can see, I have lined the switch for the siding, and this is more a testament to how much work I've put into these easy track switches than the locomotive itself, but it does handle even the switches, the diverging route through the switches with no problem, not even a stumble. Now if you'll allow me to go full country on y'all for just a second. This locomotive right here is about sharper than a box of brand new samurai swords. I tell you what, this is a fun engine to run. My only gripe is that, you know, the thing doesn't have sound, which is a very, very, very solvable issue to have. And I have absolutely no complaints with this engine, and it's rare that I come across a locomotive, not only non-SP, but in HO scale and outside of the era that this railroad is set for, that makes me kind of wish that I was running steam era, modeling the steam era, or at least the transition era, so I could have a legitimate excuse to drop the money on one of these other than just it looks pretty and I want it. So I may or may not go full retard here in a few later on down the road and try to pick one of these up just for giggly purposes, but this is a fun engine. I do highly recommend it, and like I said, if you're an 18-inch radius operator like myself, you will have to do that small little modification. You will have to sacrifice the detailing on the underside of the tender body, but I tell you what, that is a worthwhile sacrifice, because honestly, how many times have you and the boys sat around drinking beer in the train room going, damn, that's a sharp underside of that tender? I tell you what, that's classy. I've never done that, and I don't know anybody that has, so that's a very very bearable sacrifice in the name of operation. But if you got, you know, 22 or 24-inch radius and higher, then cool, you're in luck. This thing will run, no modifications required. I thank y'all for watching. I hope y'all found this to be an entertaining video. And I hope y'all have had a wonderful and merry holiday season. And Happy New Year, y'all.